No one gave you an instruction manual for your body the day you were born. You know why you can sleep 8 full hours and still wake up feeling tired? It's because your body was resting, but your soul was wandering. When you sleep, your soul can drift away to wherever it wishes. It doesn't bring your brain with it, so you don't remember where it went. During the day, you go to school, read books, and fill your brain with knowledge, but your soul remains untouched by that learning. Your soul is like a curious 3-year-old child. The moment your body rests, it wants to run, to play, to jump from place to place, chasing whatever catches its attention. This is something few people ever speak about, yet it quietly shapes how you feel each morning. That's why I invite you to listen to a Zen story as you fall asleep. Even while your body drifts into slumber, your soul will hear it, and like a child fascinated by a tale, it will stay close, listening deeply. While it listens, it learns. While it learns, it grows. In this way, your soul nourishes your energy, your chakras strengthen, and by morning, you awaken not just rested, but aligned. Because when your energy is good, the day flows smoothly, and good things are naturally drawn to you. So tonight, let the story begin. Before we start, think about the problem that's been on your mind. Maybe it's something you need to decide tomorrow, or a question that has been making you feel stuck. Hold that thought, because this story is not just a story. It's a journey that can help you see things more clearly. If you listen until the end, I believe you'll find the answer you've been looking for. Not from me telling you what to do, but from the way the story will speak to your heart. So if tomorrow feels heavy and you're not sure which way to go, stay with me. By the time the monk finishes his journey, you'll know your next step. Let's begin. The monastery sat on the far edge of the mountains, where the clouds drifted low enough to brush the roof tiles and the wind carried the scent of pine needles. Its walls were plain, its gates unadorned, and its silence was deep enough to make the sound of a single broom sweeping the courtyard seem loud. Within those walls lived the young monk Liang, whose head had been shaved clean when he was a boy and whose robe was patched in places where time had frayed the cloth. He had never known another life, for he had been left at the gates by strangers whose faces he could no longer recall. The abbot had taken him in, fed him, taught him the chants and the duties of the monastery, and in time, Liang had grown into his role, like a tree into its roots. His days were simple. He rose before the sun, washed his face with the cool water drawn from the stone well, and joined the other monks in the hall for morning recitation. After that, he swept the courtyard, polished the brass incense burners, and worked in the vegetable garden that lay beyond the northern wall. The rest of the day was given to copying scriptures by hand, listening to the elder monks give quiet talks on virtue, and meditating in the shadow of the pine trees. To Liang, life seemed unchanging, each day a mirror of the one before. Yet beneath that stillness, a question had begun to stir. It was not a loud question, nor an urgent one, but it came to him like the faint echo of a bell from far away. It asked what the words in the scriptures truly meant, and why the path to wisdom seemed always described in riddles and metaphors. He knew the chants by heart, the gestures and the rules, but he did not yet feel the truth they pointed to. Sometimes, while sweeping the leaves in the courtyard, he would pause to watch the way the sunlight fell through the branches, or how the wind made the prayer flags ripple. In those moments, he felt a kind of stillness that no teaching had explained to him, and he wondered if that too was part of the way. One evening, after a long day of copying texts, Liang carried his brush and ink back to the small room he shared with another novice. The sun had set behind the western peaks, leaving the sky painted in deep orange and violet. He sat by the window, looking out at the fading light, and the thought returned, was wisdom something to be found in these halls, or did it lie beyond the monastery walls? He did not speak of it, for the rules were clear, and a novice's duty was to learn, obey, and wait for understanding to ripen like fruit in its season. But life has its own way of answering questions. One morning, the abbot summoned Liang after the recitation. The abbot was a man whose face seemed carved from years of patience, his eyes both sharp and kind. He told Liang to accompany an elder monk named Shen to the market in the valley below. Supplies were needed, and the journey would take 2 days. Liang had never left the monastery except to fetch water from the nearby stream, and the thought of going beyond the gates made his heart beat faster. He bowed in acceptance, not daring to show his excitement. The road down the mountain was steep, lined with rocks and wildflowers. As they walked, Shen moved with steady steps, neither rushing nor slowing, and spoke little. Liang tried to match his pace, feeling the unfamiliar weight of a travel bundle on his back. The air grew warmer as they descended, and the sounds of the valley began to reach them, the distant bark of a dog, the clatter of hooves, the laughter of unseen children. When they reached the market, Liang's eyes widened at the sight of stalls filled with baskets of fruit, bundles of herbs, bolts of cloth, and tools he had never seen. People moved in all directions, voices overlapping in a constant hum. He followed Shen closely, helping to carry the goods they purchased. As they were leaving, Liang noticed an old woman sitting by the side of the road. She was selling small clay cups, each one painted with a simple pattern. No one stopped to buy from her. Her hands trembled slightly as she held one out to a passerby, who shook his head and walked away. Something in her face, tired yet calm, stayed with Liang as they climbed the path back to the monastery. That night, he thought about her as he lay on his mat. She had been alone in the crowd, her work unremarkable, yet she had waited without complaint. He wondered if there was a kind of strength in that, a patience different from the discipline he knew in the monastery. In the months that followed, the question inside him grew. It was no longer about the words of the scriptures alone, but about the way life unfolded beyond the walls. The abbot seemed to sense this, for he began to send Liang on more errands to deliver herbs to the healer in the next village, to fetch wood from the forest, to help repair the bridge after the spring floods. Each journey brought him into contact with people whose lives were simple yet full. A farmer who sang while planting rice, a carpenter who carved small birds from leftover wood, children who played in the rain without caring about the mud on their clothes. None of them spoke of wisdom, yet they seemed to live it in their own way. One winter morning, after a night of heavy snow, Liang was tasked with carrying food to a hermit who lived in a hut halfway up the northern ridge. The climb was difficult, the path buried under white drifts, and the wind cut through his robe like knives. When he reached the hut, the hermit welcomed him inside without a word, offering him hot tea brewed over a small fire. They sat in silence, sipping slowly. Outside, the snow continued to fall, erasing all paths. In that quiet, Liang felt a strange peace, as if nothing more was needed in that moment. When he rose to leave, the hermit simply nodded, and Liang stepped back into the whiteness, warmed not just by the tea, but by the shared stillness. By the time spring returned, Liang's heart was restless. He could no longer ignore the feeling that the way was not something he could memorize or recite, but something he had to walk, step by step. One evening, while tending the garden, the abbot came to stand beside him. They worked in silence for a while, pulling weeds and loosening soil. Then the abbot said, almost as if speaking to himself, "A seed does not seek the sun. It grows, and the sun finds it." Liang looked at him, but the abbot had already turned away, moving to another row. The words sank into him like water into dry ground. That night, Liang lay awake, listening to the wind in the pines. He understood that his path might lead beyond the monastery, not because he was abandoning it, but because he needed to let the world be his teacher. The walls had given him roots, but now he needed to see where his branches might reach. He did not tell anyone of his thoughts, for he knew the moment would come when the road called him. It came sooner than he expected. A messenger arrived one morning with news that a distant village had been struck by illness, and help was needed to carry medicine from the city. The journey would take weeks. The abbot called for volunteers, and without hesitation, Liang stepped forward. The abbot studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Walk carefully," he said. "The road is the teacher you have been asking for." Before dawn the next day, Liang set out with a small group, carrying his share of the medicine on his back. As he passed through the gates, he looked back once at the monastery, its roofs barely visible in the mist. Then he faced forward, feeling the weight of the path ahead. He did not know what he would find, only that he must keep walking. The wind stirred the hem of his robe, and somewhere deep within, the quiet bell of his question rang again, not seeking an answer, but guiding his steps into the unknown. The road wound down from the mountains into a wide valley where the early light painted the fields in shades of gold. Liang walked in silence with the small group of monks and villagers who had taken on the task of carrying medicine to the distant village. Each man carried a bundle strapped across his back, and the sound of their sandals pressing into the dirt path made a steady rhythm. The air smelled of damp soil and fresh grass, and mist clung to the edges of the river they followed. As they walked, Liang felt both the weight of his burden and the lightness of having stepped into something unknown. Every bend in the path seemed to hold a secret. They passed through hamlets where chickens wandered freely and smoke curled from low roofs. People paused in their morning work to greet the travelers, offering bowls of water or slices of steamed bread. In one village, a woman insisted they rest under the shade of her persimmon tree, and as they ate, she told them of her father, who had once been a wandering monk. She said he rarely spoke of his journeys, but she remembered how he would sometimes stand in the doorway at dusk, looking toward the mountains with a half smile, as if listening to something only he could hear. Liang carried her words with him after they left, wondering if one day he, too, would have such a look in his eyes. On the third day, the path narrowed as they entered a region of low hills. The group slowed, for the ground was uneven and sometimes slippery with moss. At midday, they reached a stream where they decided to rest. Liang knelt to wash his face, feeling the cold water flow over his hands. As he looked into the clear surface, he saw his reflection, but also the shifting light of clouds above. He thought of the monastery's well, where the water was still and deep, reflecting only what was placed directly over it. This running stream, however, carried everything with it: light, shadow, fallen leaves, without holding on. The thought settled in him like a quiet truth. Perhaps wisdom was not in holding, but in letting pass. That night, they stayed in a farmer's barn, lying on mats of straw while rain drummed on the roof. Liang could not sleep at first, listening to the steady sound. He thought of the people they were traveling to help, unseen but real in their need. The road was long and the medicine heavy, yet he felt no impatience. Instead, he felt a strange contentment in simply moving forward. The rain slowed, and he drifted into sleep with the image of the stream still in his mind. The days blurred into one another. They crossed old wooden bridges, walked through bamboo groves where the wind made a gentle clattering, and climbed ridges where they could see far into the distant fields. Rivers, small villages like scattered beads on the land. Liang began to notice how the world spoke in quiet ways. The way the morning light struck a single dew-covered leaf. The way a child's laughter carried over the noise of a busy marketplace. The way old men played a game of stones in complete silence, yet seemed to speak through their eyes. None of these were lessons written in scripture, yet each felt like a teaching. In one village, they met a blacksmith who offered them tea while they rested. His arms were strong from years of work, his face darkened by the sun, but his manner was gentle. He told them that when he was young, he had tried to force the metal into shape with quick, hard blows, but it would always crack. Over time, he learned to work with the metal's own nature, striking in rhythm with its cooling and heating. If you listen to the iron, he said, it will tell you what it can become. Liang thought of this long after they left, feeling it was not only about metal. The journey grew harder as they entered the foothills of another mountain range. The air thinned, and the wind turned sharp. Some of the older men in the group grew tired more quickly, and they began to rest more often. Liang took on extra weight from one man whose back had begun to ache, feeling the straps bite into his shoulders. Each step became heavier, yet he found a kind of focus in placing one foot after the other. The world narrowed to the path in front of him, the sound of breathing, and the pull of the straps. By the end of the day, he was too tired to think of anything else, and sleep came as soon as he lay down. One afternoon, as they descended into a valley, they came across a bridge that had been damaged by a recent flood. The planks were uneven, and the water below rushed fiercely. They crossed one by one, and when it was Liang's turn, he felt the bridge sway under his weight. Halfway across, he paused, looking at the churning water. It struck him that life often felt like this crossing, unsteady, with danger close below, yet the only way forward was to keep moving, trusting each step. When he reached the other side, his heart was beating fast, but not from fear. There was a kind of exhilaration in having moved through uncertainty. By the time they reached the village in need, the sun was setting behind the hills, casting the fields in deep orange light. The people welcomed them with gratitude, guiding them to a small building that served as a gathering hall. The village healer came to take the medicine, bowing deeply to each of them. Liang saw the relief in her face, the way her hands trembled slightly as she began sorting through the supplies. That night, they were given a simple meal of rice and vegetables, and as he ate, Liang felt a quiet satisfaction, not pride, but the sense of having been part of something necessary. They stayed for several days, helping however they could. Liang carried water from the river, repaired roofs damaged by storms, and sat with the sick to keep them company. One evening, as he walked through the village, he saw a group of children playing a game of chasing fireflies. The glow of the insects blinked in the dark like small lanterns, and the children laughed as they darted about. Liang stopped to watch, and in that moment, he felt the same stillness he had known in the hermit's hut during the snow, a stillness not of emptiness, but of fullness. When it was time to leave, the villagers gathered to see them off. The healer pressed a small bundle into Liang's hands. "A pouch of dried herbs," she said, "for tea on cold nights." He thanked her, though he knew the tea was not what mattered. It was the gesture, the simple act of sharing what little she had. As they walked away from the village, Liang looked back once, seeing the figures of the people growing smaller, until they were only shapes against the fields. The journey back was slower, for their bundles were lighter but their bodies more tired. Yet Liang found himself paying even closer attention to the road, as if each step held something to be noticed. In a small roadside shrine, he saw offerings of fruit and flowers, fresh, though no one was nearby. In a meadow, he watched a heron stand motionless for what seemed like an eternity before striking at a fish. In the quiet of dawn, he heard the first call of a bird and felt how it seemed to open the sky. When they finally returned to the monastery, the familiar sight of the gates brought a deep breath from Liang. He had left with questions and returned with more of them, yet they no longer felt like gaps to be filled. Instead, they felt like spaces in which to walk. The abbot met them in the courtyard, listening as Shen reported their journey. When Shen spoke of Liang's help along the way, the abbot simply nodded, his eyes meeting Liang's for a moment longer than usual. No words passed between them, but Liang felt as though something had been acknowledged. Days returned to their quiet rhythm, chanting, sweeping, tending the garden. Yet something within Liang had shifted. He no longer looked at his tasks as things to be completed, but as moments to be lived fully. Sweeping leaves was not only clearing the courtyard, it was the sound of the broom, the movement of the arm, the dance of the falling leaves. Copying scriptures was not only ink on paper, it was the slow breathing, the weight of the brush, the quiet space between strokes. Each act seemed to carry its own teaching if he was willing to see it. Seasons turned. Spring gave way to summer, summer to autumn. One morning, as Liang was repairing the wooden fence around the garden, the abbot came to stand beside him. After a long silence, he said, "The way is not something far from here. It is not a road you must find. It is the ground beneath your feet." Then he walked away, leaving Liang with the sound of the wind in the leaves. Liang understood that the journey was not only on the roads beyond the mountains, but also in the simple act of standing where he was. Still, he knew he would walk again. The world beyond the monastery had opened something in him, and he felt the pull of it as surely as the river is drawn to the sea. For now, he would tend to the garden, sweep the courtyard, and wait for the moment when the road called his name again. And when it did, he would not seek the way, he would walk it. The winter that followed was long and quiet, the kind of season where snow lay over the mountains for weeks, softening every sound. The monastery seemed smaller in those days, its rooms warmed by braziers, its corridors lit by the dim flicker of oil lamps. Liang moved through it with calm, performing his duties, but there was a restlessness under the surface. He no longer felt confined, but he sensed the walls could not contain all that life had to show him. The abbot's words, that the way was the ground beneath his feet, echoed often in his mind. If that was true, then the ground stretched far beyond the courtyard stones. When the snow began to melt and the rivers swelled with cold water, Liang felt the pull again. It came not as a command, but as a quiet urging from within, like the way a plant turns toward the sun without being told. This time there was no summons from the abbot, no errand to run. It was simply the sense that it was time to walk. He considered waiting for permission. Yet he remembered that seeds did not wait for someone to tell them to grow. They simply grew when the season arrived. So one morning, before the bell rang for first recitation, he packed a small bundle of clothes and food, placed the pouch of dried herbs from the healer into it, and stepped out through the monastery gates. The road was empty at that early hour. Mist drifted across the low fields, and the air was fresh with the scent of thawing earth. Liang walked without hurry, feeling each step as if it were part of the journey itself, rather than a means to reach somewhere else. The mountains rose behind him, and ahead lay the rolling green of the valley. He had no fixed destination. His only plan was to follow the road and see where it led, trusting that the way forward would offer its own teachings. By midday, he reached a village where farmers were mending their fields for planting. An old man repairing a fence greeted him and offered him a seat on an overturned basket. They shared a bowl of millet porridge, and the old man spoke of the work ahead, tilling, sowing, and hoping the rains would be kind. Each year, the man said, "We do the same, but it's never the same. The earth changes, the weather changes, and we change too. The work is in listening." Liang thought of the blacksmith from his previous journey, who had said to listen to the iron. Perhaps all things, whether metal or soil, spoke in their own way. That evening, Liang found a place to sleep in the loft of a barn with the farmer's permission. The night air was cool, and he lay awake listening to the breathing of the animals below, the rustle of hay, and the occasional creak of the wooden beams. It was different from the quiet of the monastery, yet it had its own rhythm, steady and alive. Before he slept, he drank tea brewed from the healer's herbs, feeling the warmth spread through him. In the days that followed, Liang wandered from village to village. Sometimes he offered to help with work in exchange for food or shelter. Other times, he slept under the open sky, using his bundle as a pillow. He crossed streams on narrow planks, walked through forests where sunlight dappled the ground, and climbed hills where the wind swept clear the thoughts from his mind. The more he walked, the less he felt the need to hurry. The road itself became his home, and each encounter a doorway into a new lesson. One afternoon, as he was passing through a small town, he came upon a crowd gathered in the square. A young man stood in the center, his face flushed with anger, shouting at an older man who sat quietly on a bench. From the fragments Liang overheard, the dispute was over a debt. The young man demanded repayment, his voice sharp and loud, while the older man said nothing, only meeting his gaze with steady eyes. Finally, the young man stormed off, leaving a silence behind him. Liang approached the older man and asked if he was all right. The man smiled faintly and said, "The storm has passed. The wind will blow again, but for now, there is peace." Liang did not press for details. He understood that sometimes wisdom lay in not answering anger with more anger. Further along the road, Liang met a traveling potter whose cart was piled high with clay vessels. The potter was in no hurry, stopping often to gather water from streams or rest under the shade of a tree. They walked together for several days, sharing simple meals and stories. One evening, the potter showed Liang how to shape a small cup from a lump of clay. As the wheel spun, the potter said, "The clay does not know what it will become. It only takes the shape given to it. But the hands shaping it must be steady, or it will collapse." Liang thought about this long after they parted, wondering if a person, too, was shaped by the steady hands of their own attention. Rain came in early summer, turning the roads to mud. Liang walked on, his robe damp, his sandals heavy with dirt. In one village, he helped a family carry their belongings to higher ground as the river threatened to flood. The father of the family thanked him, pressing into his hand a small carved stone in the shape of a lotus. "It is not worth much," the man said, "but it has been with us for many years. May it bring you safe crossings." Liang accepted it, feeling its smooth surface warm from the man's hand. He kept it in the pouch with the healer's herbs, as if the two gifts belonged together. The road took him next through a stretch of wild land where no villages stood for many miles. Trees arched over the path, their leaves forming a shifting canopy of green. Birds called from high branches, and sometimes a deer would dart away at his approach. At night, he built small fires to keep away the chill and the animals. In the solitude, he found that his thoughts grew quiet, like a pond after the wind has stilled. He realized he did not feel alone. The forest itself seemed to keep him company, its sounds and movements as present as any human voice. After many weeks, Liang came to a riverside town where fishermen mended nets on the shore. He spent several days there, helping to push boats into the water at dawn and pull them back in at dusk. One old fisherman, his skin weathered by years of sun and salt, told Liang that the river could not be forced to give up its fish. "You must learn its moods," he said, "and work with them. If you fight the river, you will tire before it does." Liang saw the truth of this each morning, as some boats returned full and others nearly empty. Yet the fisherman accepted it without bitterness. Eventually, Liang felt it was time to move on. He thanked the fisherman and followed the road out of town, walking until the land began to rise again. He climbed steadily, and after several days, he found himself overlooking a vast plain. From that height, he could see far into the distance small villages, winding rivers, patches of forest, and beyond them, more mountains. It struck him then that the world was far larger than he had imagined when standing inside the monastery walls. He felt both small and connected to it all, as if each path was part of the same great road. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Liang reached a small shrine by the roadside. An old woman tended a lantern there, lighting it as travelers passed. She offered him a place to rest, and they sat together, watching the light grow against the dark. She told him she had tended the shrine for more than 30 years, never leaving except to gather supplies. People ask if I grow tired of it, she said, but the world passes through here. I see it in each traveler's face. Liang understood then that walking the way did not always mean moving from place to place. Sometimes it meant standing still while the world moved around you. When he finally turned back toward the monastery, many months had passed. His robe was worn, his sandals patched, but his steps were steady and sure. He carried no answers, yet he carried something deeper, the feeling of having lived in rhythm with the road, the people, and the seasons. As the familiar mountains came into view, he knew this was not the end of his walking, but another turning of the path. The way, he thought, was not in seeking or finding, but in the quiet act of moving forward, one step at a time. The monastery's gates closed quietly behind Liang, though he did not enter with the same heart that had left many months before. His steps slowed as he crossed the courtyard, for he felt the weight of his journey in his bones. The familiar paths and worn stone floors were unchanged, yet he saw them differently, as if each wall and tree had gained new depth. The abbot was away in another monastery, so no one asked him about the road right away. He returned to his duties without ceremony, sweeping, copying texts, tending to the garden. The rhythm of life folded around him like a river returning to its banks. But the road had planted something in him, and it did not fade. He moved through each task with a sense of listening to the scrape of the broom, the rustle of the garden leaves, the faint creak of the wooden floors under his sandals. The silence of the monastery no longer felt empty. It felt alive. Still, he knew that the road beyond the mountains would call again. It was only a matter of time. The call came in an unexpected form. One morning, a small group of travelers arrived at the gates, asking for shelter. Among them was a young boy with a fever, wrapped in a thin blanket despite the warmth of the season. The monks took them in, offering food and a place to rest. Liang helped carry the boy to the infirmary and sat with him while the healer prepared medicine. The boy's breathing was shallow, his face pale. Liang stayed by his side through the night, cooling his forehead with a damp cloth. At dawn, the boy's breathing eased, and he slept more deeply. The travelers told of a flood that had swept through their village, destroying homes and taking lives. Many had scattered, trying to find shelter or rebuild. Liang listened quietly, feeling the same pull he had felt before, the urge to walk toward those in need. This time, he did not wait for an assignment. He approached the senior monk on duty and asked to go with the travelers when they returned to help their village. The monk studied him for a moment, then nodded without question. Liang left with little more than his robe, sandals, and the pouch containing the healer's herbs and the carved lotus stone. The path to the flooded village took several days. Along the way, he saw the signs of the river's fury fields buried under mud, bridges torn from their moorings, trees uprooted and lying like fallen giants. When they reached the village, the air was heavy with the smell of damp earth and decay. Houses leaned precariously, their walls stained with watermarks. People moved slowly through the wreckage, carrying broken beams, stacking salvageable wood, and trying to clear paths through the mud. Liang set to work without hesitation. He hauled debris, helped repair roofs, and carried clean water from a well outside the damaged area. The days were long, and his body ached each night, but the work felt necessary. He saw in the faces of the villagers both exhaustion and determination. No one spoke much of what had been lost. They spoke instead of what could be rebuilt. In their quiet persistence, Liang recognized a kind of wisdom that no scripture could teach. One afternoon, as he was helping to lift a heavy beam into place, he heard a sharp crack. The beam slipped, striking the man beside him and knocking him to the ground. They rushed to lift it off him, but it was clear from the stillness of his body that he was gone. The work stopped. The man's wife came running, her cries cutting through the air. Liang stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing into him. He had seen sickness before, but not the suddenness of death like this. That night, as the village gathered to burn incense for the man's spirit, Liang sat apart, watching the flames rise into the dark. The fire's light wavered on the faces of the mourners, and he felt the fragility of each breath. In the days that followed, he found it harder to work with the same focus. The image of the man falling returned often unbidden. He began to wonder what all the walking and helping truly meant if it could be ended in an instant. Yet life in the village continued. Meals were cooked, repairs were made, children played in the drying fields. One evening, as Liang was repairing a wall, the man's wife approached. She placed a small wooden bead in his hand and said, "He wore this for years. I think he would want you to have it." Liang hesitated, unsure if he should accept, but she nodded once and walked away. The bead was smooth from years of being touched, and Liang tied it to the pouch with his other gifts. When the worst of the rebuilding was done, Liang prepared to leave. The villagers gathered to thank him, offering what little they could spare: a jar of pickled vegetables, a pair of woven sandals, a folded cloth for warmth. He accepted each gift with gratitude, feeling the weight of their kindness more than the weight of his bundle. The morning he left, the river was calm, its surface reflecting the sky as if it had never raged. He followed its course downstream, the sound of its flowing like a companion. The road ahead was quieter. He passed through forests where the only movement was the sway of branches, and through grasslands where the wind rolled over the hills in long, invisible waves. At night, he lit small fires and drank tea from the healer's herbs, sometimes fingering the wooden bead or the lotus stone as he watched the flames. The memory of the man's death stayed with him, but it no longer pressed so heavily. It was not something to forget, but something to carry a reminder that the way was walked not in certainty, but in the presence of each moment, however brief. One evening, he came to a village where the people were gathered in the central square. They welcomed him to join them, explaining that they were celebrating the first harvest of the season. Lanterns hung from the trees, casting warm light over the scene. There was food, music, and laughter. Liang accepted a bowl of rice wine and sat watching the dancers move in a circle. He noticed an old man standing apart, smiling faintly but not joining in. Liang approached and asked if he would dance. The old man shook his head and said, "I have danced many times. Tonight, I watch." Liang stayed beside him, and together they watched the dancers' feet tracing patterns in the dust. It struck him then that there was wisdom in both joining the dance and in stepping back to watch. The next morning, he left before the village stirred. The road curved through low hills, and the sun rose behind him, casting his shadow long ahead. He thought of the abbot's words, about the seed and the sun, and of all he had seen since leaving the monastery the first time: the stream carrying leaves without holding, the blacksmith's rhythm, the fisherman's patience, the shrine keeper's stillness, the villager's resilience. Each moment seemed like a bead on a string, connected yet separate. Perhaps the way was not a single road, but many small paths woven together, some ending suddenly, others looping back. As he walked, a storm rolled in, and rain fell in heavy sheets. The road turned to mud, and water pooled in his sandals. He pulled his robe tighter and pressed on, knowing there was no shelter nearby. Hours later, he came upon a small cave in the side of a hill and ducked inside. The sound of the rain echoed softly in the hollow space. He built a small fire and sat near its warmth, watching the flames flicker against the stone walls. The cave was empty except for a few dried leaves blown in by the wind. In the stillness, he felt a deep quiet settle over him, as if the road had paused to breathe. When the rains stopped, he stepped outside to find the air washed clean, the leaves on the trees shining with droplets. The road stretched ahead, winding into the distance. He adjusted his bundle and began walking again, his feet sinking slightly into the softened earth. There was no rush to arrive anywhere. The road itself was enough. By the time he reached the next town, he had walked for many weeks. His robe was stained with travel, his sandals worn thin, but his steps were steady. He stayed in the town for a time, helping in the market and sleeping in a storeroom offered by a kind merchant. He watched the daily life of the place, the way the vendors set up their stalls each morning, the way the children chased one another through the narrow streets, the way the old men played games under the shade of the banyan tree. Each action seemed ordinary, yet together they formed the fabric of the town's life. Eventually, the pull to move on returned. Liang left quietly one morning, following the road toward the horizon. The mountains lay far in the distance, their peaks softened by haze. He did not know when he would return to the monastery, or if he would at all. It no longer seemed to matter. The way was under his feet, in the breath he took, in the faces he met, in the sound of the wind through the trees. To seek it was to miss it. To walk it was to live it. The road turned east, leading Liang through a stretch of land where the hills rolled like slow waves and the rivers wound lazily through fields. It was late summer, and the air was thick with the scent of ripe grain. Farmers worked in the fields from morning until dusk, their voices carried on the wind. Liang walked without urgency, stopping sometimes to rest beneath the shade of a tree or to watch the play of clouds across the sky. His bundle was lighter than it had ever been. Much of what he had once carried had been given away or worn down. The pouch with the healer's herbs, the lotus stone, and the wooden bead was still with him, worn smooth from handling. In a small hamlet by the river, Liang stayed several days to help an old woman repair the fence around her vegetable patch. She moved slowly, her back bent with age, but her hands were sure. As they worked, she told him she had planted the same garden every year for more than 5 decades. Each season teaches me again, she said, that nothing stays the same, yet the work is always worth doing. Liang thought of the river's shifting current, the fisherman's patience, and the blacksmith's rhythm. The garden, too, had its lessons. When the fence was finished, the old woman gave him a basket of cucumbers and urged him to take them on his way. He carried them until he came to a village where children played near the well, their laughter bright in the air. He shared the cucumbers with them, and they ate with the kind of focus that only children give to something simple and good. Watching them, Liang felt a quiet joy, not for the act itself, but for the way it had happened naturally, without planning, one gift leading into another. The days grew shorter as he walked, and autumn began to settle over the land. Leaves turned gold and red, drifting down to carpet the roads. The air held the faint bite of coming frost. In one town, he met a traveling musician who played a bamboo flute in the marketplace. The music was slow and low, weaving through the noise of trade until it seemed to draw a circle of stillness around itself. Liang sat listening until the musician finished. They shared a meal afterward, and the musician said, "The song is not in the flute. It is in the breath that moves through it." Liang thought of the way seemed to move through everything he had seen, not belonging to any one thing but revealing itself in their passing. As the season deepened, Liang found himself walking into a region where the mountains rose again, their peaks touched with snow. The path grew steeper, and the nights colder. He accepted shelter where it was offered and slept under the stars when it was not. The cold made each breath visible in the morning, and the frost made the grass sparkle as though scattered with tiny lights. The beauty of it was sharp, almost painful, in its clarity. One day, as he climbed a narrow trail, he came upon a man sitting by the side of the path with a broken cart. The wheel had splintered, and the man was staring at it with frustration. Liang stopped to help, and together they bound the wheel with rope enough to move the cart to the next village. The man offered him payment, but Liang declined. "You have already paid me," he said, "with the work we did together." The man looked at him strangely, then smiled and bowed before going on his way. The road led Liang higher into the mountains, where the air thinned and the silence deepened. Villages were fewer here, and the land felt vast and unending. He walked for long stretches without seeing another soul. At night, the stars seemed close enough to touch, and the moon cast silver over the slopes. In the quiet, he found his thoughts growing fewer, like leaves falling from a tree in winter. There was no need to name the things around him. They simply were, and so was he. One afternoon, while following a ridge, Liang saw a small building ahead, a hermit's hut, weathered by wind and snow. Smoke rose from its chimney. He knocked softly, and an old man answered, his eyes bright despite his years. The hermit welcomed him inside and offered tea. They sat in silence for a long while, the only sound the bubbling of the kettle. Finally, the hermit said, "The way is like this tea. If you do not drink it, you cannot know it, and once you have drunk it, there is no need to speak of it." Liang smiled, understanding more than the words themselves. They shared the tea slowly, and when Liang left the next morning, the hermit pressed into his hand a small packet of dried leaves. "For the road," he said. The trail eventually began to slope downward, leading toward valleys filled with the soft haze of late autumn. Liang walked through fields where the harvest had been gathered and only the stubble remained. The land seemed to be resting, waiting for winter. In one village, he was invited to a gathering where the people shared stories by the fire. Some tales were of hardship, others of joy, but all were told with the same ease, as if they were simply part of the same long thread. Liang listened without speaking, feeling the warmth of the fire and the closeness of the people. When he left the next morning, one of the elders walked with him to the edge of the village. "The road remembers your steps," the man said. "It carries them with it." Liang walked on, wondering at the truth of that. The last weeks of his journey took him through lands he had not seen before, marshes where reeds swayed in the wind, rocky outcrops where goats climbed with ease, and forests so dense that only narrow beams of light reached the ground. Each place had its own silence, its own rhythm. Liang moved through them without hurry, carrying the sense that the road was not leading him anywhere in particular, but that each step was complete in itself. One evening, he came upon a wide river with no bridge. The only way across was a shallow ford, but the current was strong. He stepped into the water slowly, feeling its cold push against his legs. Each step had to be placed with care, yet there was no fear, only the awareness of the water's movement and his own balance. When he reached the far side, he stood for a moment, watching the river continue on its way. It did not pause for him, nor had it resisted him. It simply flowed. As winter began to take hold, Liang found himself once more at the foot of the mountains where the monastery stood. He had not planned to return, but his steps had carried him here without intention. The path upward was familiar, yet it felt different now, as if each stone had been laid fresh. When he reached the gates, the abbot was standing there, as if expecting him. They exchanged no words, only a nod, and Liang entered. Life in the monastery resumed as it always had: morning recitation, work in the gardens, the tending of small fires in the halls. Yet Liang felt no separation between these walls and the open road. When he swept the courtyard, he felt the same presence as when he had crossed the river. When he drank tea in the evening, he thought of the hermit's hut. When the wind moved through the pines, it was the same wind that had moved through the forests and fields beyond the mountains. The way had never been somewhere else. It had been here, in each step, each breath, each act, all along. Seasons turned again, and sometimes travelers came to the monastery seeking answers. Liang would greet them, offer tea, and listen. If they asked about the way, he would simply say, "Don't seek it, walk it." Some understood, others did not, but he knew that understanding was not something he could give. It would come, if it came, on their own road. Years passed. Liang grew older, his hair turning silver where it grew, his hands lined from work and weather. He still walked beyond the monastery from time to time, not to seek, but to be with the road. Each journey was both the same and different, as the seasons changed and the faces along the way changed. Sometimes he returned with nothing, sometimes with a small gift, a carved bird from a child, a pebble from a river, a handful of dried herbs from a healer. Each one joined the pouch that had traveled with him from the start. One late spring morning, Liang rose before dawn and stepped into the courtyard. The air was cool, and the first light touched the tops of the mountains. He stood for a while, listening to the faint rustle of leaves, the distant call of a bird. Then he began to walk, not toward the gates, not toward the road, but simply across the stones, each step as complete as the whole journey. He understood then, without thought, that the way had no beginning and no end. It was the walking itself, and so he kept walking, as he always had. The core lesson from "Don't seek the way, walk it" is that don't keep searching for the path as if it's hidden. Walk with awareness, and the path will reveal itself under your feet. And so, the monk's journey came quietly to an end, not because the world had changed, but because his eyes had learned to see. He no longer asked where the way was. He felt it in the weight of each step, in the softness of the evening air, in the slow, steady rhythm of his own breath. The road was never a straight line from here to there. It was alive, a companion, walking beside him in every moment. And perhaps tonight, as you rest, you might notice the same truth, that you are already walking the way. No maps, no searching, no rushing, just the quiet understanding that the path you seek has been under your feet all along. So now, walk gently, walk awake, and good night.